doors you came in and left as a fire exit. There was something else I was supposed to mention as well. Oh yeah, there's a defib over at LSTM reception, but somebody familiar with where that is will probably go and fetch it in the event of needing a defib. And then I'd like to introduce Barry, who has kindly come up to speak to us from UKHSA Horton. He's a strong collaborator with LSTM and has a huge amount of experience in outbreak investigations.
Cool, thank you, Susie. So today we're going to be looking at high consequence infectious diseases, in particular what cases we have seen in the UK. And it's probably worth us just spending a few minutes defining what we mean by a high consequence infectious disease, because this is a term that was first coined in 2016, and it is starting to be adopted more and more by national and international public health agencies, but it is somewhat of a nebulous term. Now, UK government do recognise the term HCID, and on the screen is the exact definition that we worked at the moment. So this is an acute infectious disease, typically has a high case fatality rate, may or may not have effective prophylaxis or treatment, is often difficult to recognise and detect rapidly, and has the ability to spread in the community with healthcare settings. But even with those points listed, it's still somewhat nebulous, and it's really this point at the bottom, that this is a disease that requires an enhanced individual population and system response to ensure that it's managed effectively. That's really the key defining feature here. But even with this, there's still some uncertainty of what is or isn't infectious disease. So, unsurprisingly, we have a list, and this is the current HCID list for the UK. And on this list, we have 15 distinct diseases which are caused by 18 causative agents. The reason why there's a difference in the numbers is because we have 4 types of avian influenza that can cause avian influenza disease: H5N1, H5N6, H7N7, and H7N9. So 15 diseases, 18 pathogens. They're split into 2 categories. We have contact and airborne, and this is dependent on their main route of transmission. 0 pathogens on the list are endemic in the UK. The closest we've got is H5N1. DEFRA do not consider H5N1 to be endemic in the UK, even though we get sporadic outbreaks and the very occasional human case, as you'll see later on. Only 1 disease on the list is caused by a bacterial pathogen, so this is Yersinia pestis, but it's only the pneumonic form of plague that is considered to be an HCID. If you get bubonic plague, that's not an HCID. And the question of what ends up on the list, this is actually reviewed regularly by the Emerging Infections and Zoonoses group at UKHSA. They will recommend pathogens to be added or removed, but there is a lot of input from other people before the list is finalised. It's also worth mentioning that we have 3 diseases that have been removed from the list. They were once on it, but they have been delisted. So COVID-19 was on the list for about 6 weeks in 2020. It was added in mid-February 2020, before we started getting significant cases in the UK. And as the number of human cases quickly overwhelms our ability to treat these cases with HCID, it was then delisted, and this was at the time that the UK launched its coronavirus action plan. Clade 2B Mpox was also delisted in 2022, and 2A was delisted in 2023. And there is some discussion at the moment about clade 1A. This is an ongoing discussion, but certainly as of yesterday when I last checked it, clade 1A and 1B are still on the list. Sorry, I meant to say 1B might be delisted. That is the one that we've got some cases of at the moment. And again, I've got a slide on that at the end. We will cover that. So, what happens in terms of human cases? The first thing we need to do is we need to be able to detect these. And detections of HCIDs will usually go through the imported fever service. This is a clinical advisory and specialist diagnostic service for medical professionals who manage travellers who've returned to the UK with a fever. And if it's determined that a sample from these patients requires testing for one of these HCID diseases, a sample will be sent to the Rare and Imported Pathogens Laboratory at UK HSA Porton, which is where I work, not in Ripple itself, but that is the institute I work at. There are a few diseases which go to Colindale. These are mainly the respiratory diseases. They'll go to the respiratory virus reference unit. And if you're interested, this is a very simple chart showing the number of calls that IFS receives on a monthly basis. And we're showing this one here because this is 2024. They normally get somewhere between 50 and 100 calls per month. But we had a spike in August last year, which coincided with the public health emergency of international concern that was declared regarding clade 1 mpox virus. So all of a sudden we have this spike in the number of cases being referred to the imported fever service. Now, if Ripple find any of these clinical samples to be positive, the patient will be admitted to a treatment centre, an HCID treatment centre. There are 6 cities in the UK that have treatment centres. I think there's 11 in total. Liverpool, Oxford, Bristol, Newcastle, Sheffield and London. There are a few factors that will determine where they'll go. The primary one is the location of the patient. We don't want to be transporting them across the country if it can be avoided. But there are other factors such as whether they have a contact or airborne HCID and whether they are an adult or a paediatric case, because these centres will have a speciality. But we do have numerous centres spread across the UK that can treat HCID cases. If they have a contact HCID, the likelihood is that they'll end up at a contact HCID treatment centre and they will be Trexler isolator. This won't be the case if it's a paediatric case, but certainly for adults. So this is, in essence, primary containment of the case. So the benefit of this system is it's the best scenario in terms of the healthcare worker. The patient is fully contained. They can access the patient through these sleeves on the isolator. There's less PPE, less training that is required to get the healthcare worker into that environment to assist with patient care. The downside to these types of isolator is that they're not particularly nice places to be for the patient. So this is an image of what a patient would see when they are in the isolator. So it's a bit of a scary environment. And this is one of the reasons why we would not take this approach with paediatric cases. In contrast, the airborne isolation rooms are a lot more what we're used to with NHS rooms. It has an ante-room leading into a bedroom and a bathroom. There we can get the pointer working. So in the bathroom, there's a ventilation grille. So this would be drawing air in through from the main corridor into the ante-room, into the patient room, and then out where it will be filtered. So this is giving you negative pressure cascade. It means that any pathogen in the environment is less likely to end out in the main corridor. But it's a lot nicer place to be, but it's still a fairly basic environment. You've got a bed, a table, a small TV, but there is this console panel in the room. So in theory, just about any medical procedure that needs to be performed, the machinery can be wheeled into the room and used in this isolation facility rather than transferring the patient out into a specialist facility elsewhere in the hospital. In terms of PPE, there's quite advanced PPE because we haven't got this primary isolation of the patient. And on the left is Susie, and on the right is me. I backlit myself for plausible deniability reasons. This is when we went to Royal Free Hospital in 2022. Lovely views of North London. But as you can see, there's a lot of PPE here. We've got scrubs, we've got gowns, we've got aprons. And in particular, at Royal Free, we've got an FFP3 mask, which is something that I do not like to wear because normally I have a beard. And if I'd been up here 7 days ago, I would have had quite a large beard. But I was back at Royal Free last week sampling around a Clade 1B Mpox patient. So I have to be clean shaven for that. There is a plan to bring in positive pressure respirators for healthcare workers and visiting scientists like me. That is being adopted at St Thomas's Hospital, which I'm in favour of, but those are fairly expensive bits of PPE, so they're starting to be rolled out across the HCID network. So that's the basic introduction, so everyone is aware what a high consequence infectious disease is and how they are managed. The reason we're here today is to discuss what cases we've seen in the UK, because as has already been mentioned, none of the pathogens that cause these diseases are endemic in the UK. But before we start with the cases themselves, it's probably worth noting what's not in scope here, because there's quite a bit, and we're not covering the public health emergencies of international concern. And there's 3 of these. The first one is the original SARS outbreak in 2003. Now, technically, this isn't a public health emergency of international concern, but it is the outbreak that triggered the update to the international health regulations that brought about the term of public health emergency of international concern. In 2003, the UK reported 4 cases of SARS. It was originally reported to be 8 probable cases. 4 of those were delisted, and a total of 4 were reported to the WHO. No deaths in those 4 cases. Now, we actually did something very proactive back in 2003. As this outbreak was starting, we realised there was a potential that cases in the UK could overwhelm our healthcare system. We did have isolation rooms available, but it was decided that the way to manage cases in the UK, rather than sending them to specialist isolation facilities like Coppets would be to treat them in a local hospital that had a suitable isolation room. And that actually worked very well here. The number of cases didn't overwhelm our NHS, and everyone was treated without transporting them to various places across the country. So no cases were actually treated in an HCID centre that would now be considered to be an HCID centre today. That's a bit different to what happened in 2020 with COVID-19. Now, as I already mentioned, COVID-19 was added to the HCID list as we were diagnosing our first cases. And initially, any positive case detected was treated in an HCID centre. But we know how quickly this pandemic took hold in the UK and other countries. Very soon, the number of cases that were identified completely overwhelmed the HCID network. And so we started triaging. And it's then started being just cases, symptomatic cases, and then only those severe cases or those with underlying medical conditions. But even as we started changing the necessary criteria to admit someone to an HCID centre, the number of cases was still day by day rising and quickly overwhelming the system. So within 6 weeks, it was just we needed to rely on the whole of the NHS to deal with the cases that were in the UK. And then we also had a public health emergency of international concern in 2022 with Mpox. This is clade 2b. Again, we've got an unknown case number here. When we started detecting cases, they were all admitted to HCIDs, but quickly overwhelmed the capacity of the system. So then it went down to only patients with underlying medical conditions who were admitted. So we're not putting these cases in this review for the simple reason that apart from SARS in 2003, we don't actually have a good idea of the number of patients that were actually treated in these isolation rooms. Finally, for not in scope is smallpox, and there's a very simple reason why smallpox is not on the HCID list. And that's because the World Health Assembly declared that the world was eradicated of smallpox. It is a disease that no longer exists. However, we are all aware that there is a non-zero risk that we will see cases. Again, the virus is still held in 2 facilities, one in the US, one in Russia. And we are also in an age of synthetic biology. So you might know that in 2017, a group decided that it would be a good idea to generate a virus synthetically in a laboratory, and the virus they chose to demonstrate this potential was horsepox virus, which probably would have been somewhere near the bottom of my list of viruses to try this on, because if you can do this with horsepox virus, it's probably possible to do it on smallpox virus. So although it's not in scope, there is one case which I think is worth looking at. So again, some of you might be aware that the last natural human infection of smallpox occurred in 1977 in Somalia. This was supposed to be the last human case of smallpox ever, but it was not. In 1978, Janet Parker contract smallpox while working at the University of Birmingham Medical School. Now, Janet Parker wasn't a microbiologist, she was a medical photographer. And on the 11th of August, she had her first symptoms. A characteristic rash developed on the 15th of August. And then 9 days later, she was diagnosed with smallpox, which is actually a fairly rapid time for diagnosis, considering that this is the late 1970s, and the UK hadn't seen a case of smallpox in about a decade at this point. And you've probably already seen the headline or the front page of the newspaper on the right-hand side, so you've guessed the outcome of this story. But it's actually more harrowing than just Janet's unfortunate death. On the 5th of September, her father dies of cardiac arrest. Her father is also in an isolation centre in the Midlands, because both her mother and father were high-risk close contacts. The father did not contract smallpox, but you can imagine that the stress of his daughter fighting for her life and him and his wife being in isolation might have contributed to this cardiac arrest. The following day, the head of the microbiology department, who was also the lead internal investigator, commits suicide and left a very harrowing suicide note apologising for misplacing the trust that had been given to him. And the following day, Janet's mother was diagnosed with smallpox. And the one silver lining of the story is she did survive here. She was vaccinated when Janet was diagnosed, and she survived her illness. And so she became the last known person to be infected with smallpox. But on the 11th of September, Janet Parker died and became the last known death from smallpox. In 1980, the Shooter Report was published. This was led by Professor Shooter, and this is often described as one of the most damning official reports that's ever been published. And the conclusion was workplace exposure resulting from widespread negligence, although they did not define the exact route of transmission because there are several possibilities. The most commonly believed route of transmission for how this occurred is a shared ventilation system. Both the microbiology department that was working on smallpox virus and the photography lab where Janet was working were on the same ventilation system, but it has never been conclusively proven. So that's the stuff that we're putting to one side. What is left? And we start our story in 1962. And this is the story of Geoffrey Bacon, who worked at the Microbiological Research Establishment in what is now known as DSTL, the Defence Science and Technologies Laboratory. Now, again, not a lot is known about this story. As jumping ahead, the inquiry about this incident was performed by the War Office at the time, so this would be like the Ministry of Defence today, and it was a private inquiry, so very little has been published. It's in the public domain. What we do know that is in late 1962, Geoffrey Bacon fell ill and consulted his local GP. And it seems reasonable to deduce that Geoffrey Bacon did not disclose to his GP that he worked on Yersinia pestis. Because you would believe that if this was disclosed, that they might have taken a different course of action. The course of action that was taken was prescribing some bed rest, and then when his condition deteriorated a few days later, he was admitted to Odstock Hospital. It's now Salisbury District Hospital. It was on the 1st of August that people as what is now DSTL became aware that Geoffrey Bacon was not attending his place of work, and started to investigate where he was, and then learnt that he was in Salisbury District Hospital, and they went down there to speak to the medical personnel there. And they asked, have you considered whether this could be pneumonic plague? To which the medical team turned around and said, absolutely not. We haven't seen a case of plague in the UK for nearly 50 years. Why would we have considered this? They were not aware that he was working on this pathogen. Unfortunately, it was a matter of hours after this conversation happened that Geoffrey Bacon died, and via post-mortem, it was confirmed that he did, in fact, die of pneumonic plague. So a private inquest was held, and the outcome was death by misadventure via probable laboratory-acquired infection. And this was the first case of plague in the UK since 1918, which is why there is an asterisk at the top here, because I was hoping we were going to be able to put a nice defined time limit here, but it turns out that when you have one of your HCID pathogens, which was endemic and has caused thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths in the UK, it sort of makes that quite difficult, which is why we are starting from 1962. Now, I'm going to go through the cases by decade. There was nothing else in the 1960s, so we're going to jump forward. And we're going to deal with the 70s and 80s in one go, because there is a common theme here. 20 years, 10 cases, and 9 of the 10 of these cases were Lassa fever. And there's a lot of similarities between these 9 cases. They were all imported from endemic regions. 8 of the 9 recovered. We've got a lot of healthcare workers who were out in Sierra Leone and Nigeria, 2 countries with which we have colonial history, who fell sick and were later diagnosed as having Lassa. But there is one case here in 1976 which is not Lassa. This case was very different. So this is the story of another Geoffrey. This is Geoffrey Platt. And Geoffrey Platt was a scientist who worked in what is now the CL4 lab at Porton Down. And Porton played the lead role in responding to the 1976 Ebola Sudan outbreak. And all the work was handled in our brand new maximum containment facility, which was built after the discovery of Marburg virus nearly a decade earlier. Both the CDC and the UK decided we needed to build maximum containment facilities. You can see this is what it looked like in the 1970s, and this is what it looks like today. Now, from an equipment point of view, not much has changed in there. What has changed is the techniques, the risk assessments, the protocols that the workers use in this facility. And this is Geoffrey Platt at the top here. This photo was taken as part of a press open day for the opening of our new maximum containment facility. But in 1976, Jeffrey Platt was working in this new suite with the samples that were sent back from the outbreak in Sudan. And unfortunately, he suffered a needle stick injury. Now, at the time, it was believed that this was going to be a near miss. They tried to encourage bleeding from where he thought that the injury occurred, and they couldn't encourage any blood to be drawn. So they thought that it hadn't penetrated through the skin. But he was monitored daily, and when he started to develop a fever, he was transported to Coppett's Wood isolation facility in London, which has since moved to the Royal Free Hospital. He suffered a severe, moderate form of Ebola, but he did suffer some long-term sequelae, which could have been due to the Ebola virus infection. It also could have been because he was given the entire world supply of interferon at the time, and he actually blames the interferon for some of the mental fog that he had for the So that's the 70s and 80s. In the 1990s, there was just one case, and that is a maybe. So this story starts on the 20th of December 1997, when a 78-year-old British female was admitted to Paul Hospital. She had a fever of unknown origin with recent travel to rural Zimbabwe, and the initial working diagnoses were malaria or typhoid fever. But on the 25th of December, her condition deteriorated. We had thrombocytopenia and melena and hemorrhagic rash. And at this point, someone wondered whether this might be something a little more uncommon. And despite numerous interventions, she died a few days later. And a serum sample was collected the day before she died and sent down to Porton, which was strongly positive for CCHF IgG and weakly positive for IgM. But unfortunately, there was no paired serum sample to also analyse, and the viral isolation attempt was negative. So this was reported at the time as a suspected case of CCHF, as there was no other samples for confirmatory analysis. And I did try and see whether this was still in our CL4 facilities, because obviously we've got a lot more technological analyses available to us today, but unfortunately it has since been disposed of. So this is technically a suspected case, but we are including this in our analysis. In the 2000s, well, 4 cases, all Lassa, all travel-related, and 3 of the 4 died. Again, we're talking about Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Mali, these endemic regions for Lassa virus. And if we just take a pause here, we've covered very quickly 47 years, seen 16 cases, 13 of which are Lassa, and then we've got 1 case each for plague, Ebola, and CCHF. And if you wanted to view it this way, you could say, well, the plague and the Ebola cases are laboratory-acquired infections. Maybe that's a separate category. And that CCHF case, it's only suspected, it's not confirmed. So you could argue that it's actually only 13 cases, and all 13 of them are Lassa. And if you chose to do so, that would raise the question, why so much Lassa? And this is a chance for me to tell you about one of my most favourite stories in virology. My passion for virology is exactly for stories like this. So we became aware of Lassa in January of 1969. The first known case was an American missionary, Laura Wine. She was working in Lassa, Nigeria, which is in the northeast corner. It's a very small village in Nigeria. And she was working at a missionary hospital, and she fell ill. And the doctor at this missionary hospital realised that she was suffering from a very serious illness, which they probably were not the best people to treat. So she was air evacuated to Jos, which is on the Central Plateau. And that was not an easy decision. That is a fairly perilous flight. Well, a jeep journey to get to a plane and then a flight to Jos. But she made it, and she was treated in Jos by 2 more American missionary workers. who subsequently developed Lassa, Charlotte Shaw and Penny Pinio. And not long after, Charlotte Shaw becomes infected and unfortunately dies, and then Penny Pinio fell ill. And at this point, they realised that there was an illness which they didn't know what the cause was, and was doing quite a good job of killing these missionary workers. So they decided to medevac Penny Pinio back to the US. She was admitted to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital, where she was in critical condition, but was eventually discharged after 9 weeks. And unsurprisingly, they wanted to know what this mysterious disease was. So they sent some of Penny's blood to Yale. And Yale were, at the time, one of the places for virology. They were putting together a collection of pathogenic viruses, including the infamous Yale arbovirus collection. And Jordi Casals was one of the lead virologists of that team. He would actually go on to become an extremely famous scientist in his own right, but he was a young scientist at this time, and he was the person that was tasked with trying to isolate virus from these samples. But unfortunately, he also fell ill with Lassa and was admitted to Columbia Presbyterian. And it's frequently stated that the only reason he survived his infection was because Penny Pinio, who was still struggling with her convalescence from her illness, would come in and donate blood, and her convalescent sera was what helped Jordi Casals survive. Now, most of us would think with this incident that would surely be quite a big political issue. It seems that this didn't really raise too much in the way of concern. There was no investigation, there was no changing of protocols. But that changed in December of 1969 when another case was reported from the same laboratory. And this time it was a fatal case. And most surprisingly of all, the scientists did not work in the laboratories that were handling Lassa virus. And this shocked everyone. And they immediately closed down the laboratory. And it just so happened that CDC were opening their brand new BSL-4 laboratory in Atlanta. So all of the samples were shipped over, and this was the genesis of BSL-4 work in the United States. It also led to national and international reviews of biosafety procedures. And a lot of the stuff that we rely on today, the genesis was from this incident, from the Ebola incident at Porton and the smallpox incident in Birmingham. That was the driving force for things like ACDP, the requirement for codes of practice, the statutory responsibility for institutes, for the scientists working there. Everything, risk assessments, everything that we see as being fundamentals today, the legislative reason for that occurring were with these sorts of incidents. And if you if you're a nerd like me, I highly recommend this book, Fever: The Hunt for a New Killer Virus. This is the story of discovering Lassa. Unfortunately, there's only been one print of this, which was in the early 1970s, so any copy you find will be slightly musty. I believe there is a Kindle edition though, but it is a truly fascinating book, and if you liked anything that I've talked about on this slide, I highly recommend you track that down. So the question was, why so much Lassa? And we've got a few reasons here. There was massive interest in this new maximum containment pathogen. It was a good explanation for missionary fever. You know, plenty of missionaries have come down with unknown diseases before. We have a lot of people in the UK that were missionary workers going out to former colonial countries where Lassa is endemic. And we had good diagnostics for the time. So this all coalesced into when someone came back from this region and were unwell, they'd have their sample tested for Lassa fever. We went looking for it, so we found it. Anyway, back to the main story, and we're now in the 2010s, 4 diseases, and for the first time, no Lassa. So we've got 2 CCHF, 5 MERS, 3 Ebola, and 4 Mpox. So this is cases of Mpox before the 2022 public health emergency of international concern. 4 of the 14 died. There are some interesting occurrences in here. So we've got 2 cases of CCHF, one of which was extremely severe and unfortunately fatal. The second one, which occurred in 2014, was actually quite mild, and so mild that it took a while for anyone to even suspect that this might be CCHF. There was very little in the way of haemorrhagic manifestations, and by the time it was diagnosed, the patient was recovering and wondering why everyone was making a fuss over them. With the MERS, the first one in 2012, which was someone who was medevaced from Qatar to the UK for specialist treatment. And it was only once they were in the UK we found out that they had MERS, and it was only the second case of MERS that had ever been reported at that time. But the following year we did have an imported case, and unfortunately there were 2 further cases within the same family, and 2 of those 3 cases died. And we had another case of MERS in 2018, which was treated at Royal Liverpool University Hospital. The 3 cases of Ebola were all healthcare workers who were out in West Africa responding to that outbreak and developed symptoms either in country or on their way back to the UK. And then we had our first interactions with Mpox in the UK starting in 2018, 2 independent cases just a few days apart. And then a healthcare worker who was treating one of those cases became infected, and then a separate importation in 2019. In the 2020s, now obviously we're only looking at 4 years of the 2020 here. We've got 11 cases, 3 Mpox, 3 Lassa, and 5 H5N1. 1 of the 11 died. So if we look at starting off with the Mpox, this is 3 cases within the same family, all of which made a full recovery. The Lassa story in 2022 was very interesting. So the index case had travelled to Mali. They returned to the UK and were quite sick, but not severely sick. They presented at hospital, but quickly recovered without anyone suspecting that they had Lassa. But there was transmission to this case wife, who was pregnant. The wife was quite severely ill, but it took a while for Lassa to be suspected because she didn't have the travel history. It was only when they started digging deeper into the travel history of her husband's that someone realised that we needed to be thinking about Lassa. And unfortunately, she also there was in utero transmission, horizontal transmission, and her baby died shortly after being born. So it's a very sad story, but a timely reminder that when someone presents with clinical symptoms, you don't just focus on their travel history, you also need to think about the travel history of their close contacts. And then in 2022 and 2023, all we have seen is H5N1. And some of these probably are not true cases of H5N1, because certainly with at least 2 of these, what we're probably seeing is environmental contamination. It's the current way we're phrasing this. So many of these are workers who are tasked with cleaning down poultry farms when an outbreak of H5N1 is detected in poultry. And while they are wearing PPE, the thought is that they're getting some RNA from that environment onto a mucosal membrane, which is then picked up with the surveillance that all these workers undertake. So it's just a little bit of non-infectious RNA that has got onto the mucosal membrane, which is picked up by a swab. And the reason we think that is because they only test positive once close to the limit of detection, no symptoms. But they are recorded as a case of H5N1. So that is the timeline. So we undertook this review because we wanted to put this into the published literature, a history, and it was decided to stop in 2023 because that is when we were going to submit our manuscript. This is the image that is in that manuscript. It should be accepted next week. We've just gone through peer review and responded to that. I am going to leave this slide up at the end if anyone wants to spend a bit of time looking through it, see if you can see any trends there. But I am going to go through some of the numbers before we end this talk. So 41 confirmed HCID cases with the caveats that I've gone through, excluding the public health emergencies of international concern. 16 of these 41 were Lassa. 5 of the 16 Lassa cases unfortunately died. Only 26 of the 41 were treated in an HCID centre. There are numerous reasons why not everyone was treated there, such as retrospective diagnosis, unfortunately with some cases death prior to transfer, but there are also some who were asymptomatic and were able to be treated elsewhere. 11 of these 41 cases overall died. There's lots of different ways you can go through and analyse this. The thing that jumped out to me was that despite none of these pathogens being considered endemic in the UK, 14 out of the 41 acquired the disease in the UK, including 3 cases of Mpox, 2 of Lassa, 2 MERS, 1 Ebola, 1 plague, and 5 H5N1. This is my attempt at a graph just showing you by year the number of cases that were detected which either were treated in an HCID centre or not treated. But it is worth revisiting the list to have a look at what we've seen and what we haven't seen, because there are a number of diseases which we haven't yet seen in the UK, including Hunin, Mashupa, Lujo, Marburg, SFTS, Andes, Clade 1A Mpox. We've seen some Clade 1B recently, and Nipah. But if we have a look around the world, there are some countries which have seen these, such as Hunin virus has been seen in Belgium and the US, although the US ones were laboratory-acquired infections. Mashupo, Lujo, Marburg. Marburg is the one that jumps out to me because plenty of countries have seen imported cases of Marburg, and we haven't seen one in the UK yet. That is probably the one from the list that I'm most surprised about. But it doesn't look like any country so far has recorded an imported case of SFTS, Nipah, of high-path avian influenza, excluding H5N1, or I'm still not sure about this. I did do another literature, Clade 1A Mpox. I don't think any country has seen an imported case of that one yet. Plenty of countries have seen 1B. So what does the future hold? Well, we know that we live in an era both of climate change and also of easier travel around the world. And we're also aware of the impact that outbreaks of emerging infections have. So a number of countries will send healthcare workers when we start seeing outbreaks. So to me, it seems logical that we are going to see cases going forwards and perhaps even an increase in cases. But seeing as this review ended in 2023 and we are now in 2025, we do have the opportunity to test my hypothesis. So what have we seen since the end of this review? Well, we have seen 9 cases of Clade 1B Mpox, 8 of which were admitted to an HCID centre. Fortunately, all were mild. I think it's reasonable to assume that we're going to see more. And as I mentioned at the start, there's a possibility of removing Clade 1B Mpox from the HCID list. But we've also seen a case of H5N1. So this is linked to a poultry outbreak. There was a thought that it might actually be 2 cases at the start, both of which were admitted to the HCID centre here in Liverpool. It turned out that one of them had a different cause for their symptoms. So it's just 1 case of H5N1, and fortunately this was relatively mild. So what we can say is just in the last 4 months, from October to February, we've seen an additional 10 HCID cases, 9 of which were treated. Although, based on my criteria, we are in a public health emergency of international concern, so you could remove 9 of those 10. But I think this does prove that we are going to see cases going forward. The question is how many and what diseases are we going to see. I could have an end of acknowledgements here, so I'm just going to group everything together. Jake and Mike, who helped me do the analysis from the HCID network, it's really important for me to acknowledge all the people past and present from the Imported Fever Service, Rare and Imported Pathogens Lab and the Virus Reference Department at Colindale, and all the medical professionals that treated these patients. This is going back 75 odd years. This is not my work. So thank you to those people. And I will leave the timeline on screen. I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have.
Any questions in the room?
It's my curiosity. It's a little bit out of your topic, but I'm curious, like, how often do you detect a mosquito-borne disease?
Very regularly. So unsurprisingly, our detections of things like dengue and chikungunya follow the same trend of what's reported globally. So last year there was a very big spike for most mosquito-borne or arthropod diseases, and we saw similar increases in imported cases in the UK. So everything we see is from travellers travelling to endemic regions. You can actually access that data online if you go to the notification of infectious diseases, NOID, NOID is what it's called. You can see week by week the number of notifiable diseases that have been recorded in the UK. You can see the cases of likes of chikungunya and West Nile and dengue, but we do see plenty in the UK. See.
So it was nice to see how the regulations evolved and the security measurements and stuff being in place to protect workers has increased over time based on these tragic incidents. I would be interested to hear your thoughts, or whether you know what's the history of the philosophy in UK heavily rely on the mechanical aspect of MBSCs or the equipment in general, because in a lot of other countries they put much more emphasis on the PPE. So it's two very different hypotheses or philosophies to address this way of working. Is there any particular reason for that?
So I do actually talk a bit more on another talk. I do a talk on laboratory-acquired infections, and I go into this in a lot more detail. I don't know the specific reason of why the UK went for the engineering controls rather than the PPE. What I can say is that as our facilities are aging, we are far more open to going down having a suited system in future. But at the time, we were one of the leaders in engineering, and again at Porton we had a big engineering department. And if you look at the cases of laboratory-acquired infections and plot that against the utilisation of any sort of microbiological safety cabinet, you see the trend. So I think that's the logical reason why we went down that route. What I'm less sure about is why other countries went for the suited systems, because obviously that gives the operator more flexibility to work in the environment. So my best guess would be that we didn't actually build any new facility that required the thought of whether to adopt a suited system. Is probably the reason that we haven't done it. But I do know that going forward, it's not a block for us, that the regulators are happy for us to consider non or alternative ways of working in those environments. Yeah, interesting.
Not so far, no.
Sorry, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I was wondering, you showed a bit earlier in your talk this terrifying image of what a someone who has a contact disease where how they're treated? So the nurses and the glove, do they stay there? Because I imagine they don't. It's not like they're sleeping and eating in this cage, are they?
We don't really call it a cage.
I'm not sure what word to use, but I'm just trying to understand how it works.
So in theory, yes, the idea is that that is where they are treated. It's important to remember that the rationale behind this is that many of the people who are severely ill with contact HCID are not going to be up and about and checking for where they can get reception on their mobile phone. They are going to be sick. I'm not clinical in any way, shape or form, but I imagine that there is some sort of discussion about when the patient is well enough to be up and moving around, that maybe that then they can think about other ways of I mean, maybe Tom or Susie is a better person to. You got any thoughts?
It's an unusual thing, isn't it? And Susie and I were on a call with Jake Dunning about it this morning in the free, that the UK is one of the only systems that puts people inside the tent, probably a better phrase than a cage. But you are caged in it, you're stuck in that, and you do everything inside that Trexler capability in terms of toilet, get your full care, get your critical care interventions inside. You know, they maintain patient dignity, you know, as best they can within that. But it's a system that the UK has adopted for a number of years, and Jake's argument, who's the head of the high-level isolation unit in the Royal Free, is it works very well and has worked very well to look after critically ill patients, as per this slide with VHFs. So it is just our system, and I think there's for and against it. But I think the patient experience hasn't been too bad. So particularly for the 3 Ebola patients who are in it for quite a long time, including being pretty sick, their feedback was very positive to the clinical teams and acknowledged why the safety provided by that tent system is important. I know that they're struggling at the moment to get a new tent system, as Jake was highlighting today, that has good seals and stuff, but it's interesting. Other people are using too. So the US have systems now. You know, for WHO, when we go overseas, we have Alima cubes, which are a bit like a big Trexler, which are very good. And WHO has designed a whole new system, which is this portable 2-room tent that goes up, so you can sort of remotely observe the patient. The beauty is you can look after patients without wearing PPE. So you can observe people, particularly children, critically ill patients, without being in that PPE, which is quite difficult when it's 30 or 40 degrees, or even if you've got a beard like Barry. So, what I was going to ask you, Barry, is slightly different. So do you think that we miss a shed load of HCIDs because we know the spectrum of illness, particularly for CCHF, particularly for Lassa, is quite broad. There's loads of mild missed cases, but we here in the UK only seem to see dead sick patients.
My best guess would be yes, absolutely. Because you can look at any country, especially the endemic countries, they do a lot more, they can do more surveillance. They pick up missed cases as well, CCHF. We didn't realise that there was asymptomatic and extremely mild cases of CCHF. For a number of years, we just thought it was a severe disease. So yeah, I don't doubt for a second that there are cases that are missed. I don't think that's a fault of the system necessarily. I don't think that there's critically ill or severely ill patients that are coming in that are not getting referred into the system. But I think there's plenty of people with very mild disease. I mean, we've seen an example of one that recovered from Lassa, and it was only when his wife and his soon-to-be-born child, if that transmission hadn't occurred, that would have been a missed case. So, yeah, I think it'd be foolish to think that we're not missing them. The question is, how much? And that's probably something that we're not going to be able to answer for a long time until metagenomics and so forth. Like any person that goes to a hospital gets metagenomic analysis, that might start shedding some light on the
I
situation.
think Ripple are trying to do a bit of a look back, aren't they? I know that Kat Houlihan was doing it for, I don't know if that was for Lassa and CCHF, but looking at some of the convalescent samples. Or...
Yeah, and I don't want to comment too much on that because I don't know enough about what's happened, but I know that there has been a look back on Lassa and they are pathogens. So, but that's more geared at the people who've entered into the IFS, but is probably looking for patients that for whatever reason were not flagged for screening for a particular virus, rather than potentially someone entering into the UK and not being that sick to even enter the system in the first place.
As you know, when I did my PhD, I used the Atkinson CCHF designed probe for that. But I guess my point is that even if we think about it, because of diversity, particularly for Lassa, we may be missing it anyway, because we don't know exactly what the alternate targets are, and I think even if we think about it, test for it, we may not have the best tests, right?
100% that we are seeing all the time, or we're learning more and more that some viruses have a propensity to completely, not completely, but to have big changes in their genome, which can really alter our diagnostic tests, the mpox tests that we're using at the moment. We need a lot of vigilance to make sure that there's nothing slipping through the system. So, and we've also got to contend with diseases which we're not aware are causing us problems. You only have to look at something like SFTS. It's a fascinating story of, that was the Chinese government saying, why are we seeing so many cases which are listed as severe thrombocytopenia, severe fever with thrombocytopenia, and let's send people down there to see if we can find out what the cause is. And then they identify a virus that was previously unknown. This sort of thing is happening again and again. So the system is only as good as the diagnostics we have to drive our clinical evaluation. So as long as we're realizing that they're not perfect, then yeah, we are missing things. Just we're not sure exactly what we are missing. Again, metagenomics might help us with that. Maybe.
It's not quite being that magic one that Nick Loman used to wave around, though, right?
No, it's a long process, and we'll see.
We've got a question online asking for a bit more detail on paediatric cases and for tips on kind of managing those and how that might be arranged, particularly rooms and logistics, I think.
Again, I think you or Tom or someone else in the audience might be better, but it is important to say that we haven't had many paediatric cases in the UK, so it's certainly less developed than our experience with the adult cases. But you've probably got more experience, Susie, with...
I think it's the logistical decisions on where and how you care for those patients is going to depend a lot on how well they are and lots of different factors. So it's going to be a discussion in the HCID at that point.
Yeah, it's problematic, isn't it, Susie?
It is challenging.
Same as the pregnant woman with an HCID is also difficult because of exposure risk and trying to do the best for two individuals. And the other thing is, obviously, normally it's a cluster, isn't it? So if you've got a kid, you've normally got a mother or a father who's sick with them, and trying to keep that group of people together, as we did in Liverpool for the mpox cases. We turned a whole couple of rooms into a family suite to look after them all. Needs that case-by-case sort of planning, doesn't it, I think, as Susie highlighted.
Yeah, there needs to be flexibility in the system to do what's best for the patient, and I think those are the only cases we've had, paediatric cases, is that right? Yeah, so I don't think we've had an acutely unwell, I don't think we've had an acutely unwell paediatric case. But yeah, it's not thinking that the protocols need to be followed, it's work out what is best for that case at that time.
And having a strong network helps with that.
100%.
What proportion of the HCIDs have safe and effective vaccines?
Not many. So, mpox, and that might be it.
Ebola too, right? Well, Zaire Ebola, probably
Are
Sudan.
they licensed? Yeah,
Ebola's licensed. There's 2-3 for Ebola, isn't there? But there's nothing for Sudan licensed.
For the animals.
For the animals, and then there's a lot of developmental vaccines on that, but nothing that I think is licensed in the
Isn't there a human H5N1? I think Secura's got a...
think so.
It's surprising that Giuseppe's had 2 billion to develop vaccines for them, but yeah, it's a shame, isn't it?
Well, there's lots of candidates in trials, aren't there?
Yeah, lots in trials.
Lassa, Marburg is.
Yeah.
50 million on Lassa phase 1 trials, yeah.
Yes, the answer is not a lot.
So,
I suppose it's one of the reasons that they're likely to end up on the list. But Mpox is interesting because it was, even before 2022, we knew that the protection offered by smallpox vaccines against Mpox, we knew that that was likely going to be the case. So there was safe and effective vaccines, but it was still decided to put that on the list. So it's not a binary. If there is a vaccine, it's not an HCID.
Thanks very much for
Predator Atkinson. I'd like to do every single one of my presentations.
How are you doing? Is you all right?
Yeah, I'm.
at a time in the restaurant.
Trials unit for a while, too. Trials unit, yeah. We're
Not in a clinic yet. Not.
going to get rid
Day reviewing them. No, again. No, I think they did see the score. It's pretty on it. 13. The 4 urgent. Comes to like a week later. It's like, well, it's still on quick. I got my email last night saying.
Oh, did you get that email? All right, bye, lovely.
Are you joining the webinar as well?